Chapter 25 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadu. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Chapter 25. Teevil, Princess of the Ocean. In the old days, Coelho, the smith of the gods, was living in the Isle of Man. It was the time when Conchubar was at the court of the king of Ulster, and had nothing but the sword in his hand. He was a fine, handsome young man, and he had made up his mind to make himself a king. So he went one day to the Druid of Crawdads to ask him what he had best do. "Go thy way," said the Druid, "to the Isle of Man. There thou wilt find the great smith Coelho. Get him to make thee a sword and a spear and a shield, and with these thou shalt win the kingdom of Ulster." Conchubar went away and hired a boat and put out to sea. He landed in Man and made straight for Coelho's smithy. It was night when he got there, and the red glow of the furnace shone out into the dark. He could hear from inside the smithy the roar of the bellows and the clanging of the hammer on the anvil. When he came near, a great dog, as large as a calf, began to bay and to growl like thunder, and brought his master out. "Who art thou, young man?" said he. "O Coelho," cried Conchubar, "it is from the Druid of Crawdads that I come, and he bade me ask thee to make me a sword and a spear and a shield. For only with weapons of thy making can I win the kingdom of Ulster." Coelho's face grew black at first, but after he had gazed for a while at Conchubar, he saw that he had the look about him of one who would go far, and he said, "It shall be done for thee, but thou must wait, for the work is long." So Coelho began to make the weapons, and Conchubar waited in the island. Early one brave morning in May, when the sun had just risen over Cronk-y-Irila, he was walking on the strand, wondering to himself how much longer Coelho would be making his weapons, and thinking it was full time for him to return. The tide was going out, and the sun was shining on the wet sand. Suddenly, he saw something flashing at the edge of the waves a few paces from him. He ran up to it, and behold, it was the most beautiful woman he had ever put sight on, fast asleep. Her hair was golden, like the gorse in bloom, her skin whiter than the foam of the sea, her lips red as the coral, and her cheeks rosy like the little clouds that were flying before the face of the rising sun. The fringe of her dress of many-colored seaweeds rose and fell with the ebb and flow of the waves. Pearls gleamed on her neck and arms. Conchubar stood and looked on her. He knew that she was a mermaid, and that as soon as she awoke, she would slip back into the ocean and be lost to him. So he bound her fast with his girdle. Then she awoke and opened her eyes, which were blue as the sea, and when she saw that she was bound, she cried out with terror, "Loose me, man, loose me." Conchubar did not answer, so she said again, "Loose me, I beg thee," in a voice as sweet as the music of Ha Mor, the fairy fiddler. By this time Conchubar was feeling that he would give all he had to keep her. He answered, trembling, "Woman, my heart, who art thou?" "I am Teevil, Princess of the Ocean," said she. "Set me free, I pray thee." "But if I set thee free," said Conchubar, "thou wilt leave me." "I cannot stay with thee, Conchubar," she cried. "Set me free, and I will give thee a precious gift." "I will loose thee," answered Conchubar. "It is not for the gift, but because I cannot resist thee." He unfastened the girdle from her, and she said, "My gift to thee is this. Go now to Culain, who is making thy shield, and tell him that Teval, princess of the ocean, bids him to put her figure on the shield, and round it to grave her name. Then thou shalt wear it always in battle, and when thou shalt look on my face and call my name, thy enemy's strength shall go from them, and shall come into thee and thy men. When she had said this, she waved her white arm to Conchubar and plunged into the waves. He looked sadly for a long time at the spot where she had disappeared, and then walked slowly to the forge of Culain and gave him the message. Culain finished the mighty shield, as the princess had said, and forged also for Conchubar a golden-hilted magic sword and a spear set with precious stones. Then Conchubar, in his crimson mantle and white gold embroidered tunic, and armed with his great shield and his mighty weapons, went back to Ireland. All that the Princess of the Ocean had said came true. When he went into battle, he looked at the beautiful face in his shield and cried, "Help, Teval!" Then he felt strength come into him like the strength of a giant, and he cut his enemies down like grass. Before long he was famous all over Ireland for his great deeds, and in the end he became King of Ulster. Then he invited Culain to come and live in his kingdom, and gave him the plain of Murthemmy to dwell in. But he never again saw the lovely mermaid. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 26 of Manx Fairytales. The Wizard's Palace. Long hundreds of years ago, there was a fine palace on a mountain, sloping up from the sea. It was like a palace in a dream, built of shining marble of all colors and having great doors covered with gold. In it there lived the mighty wizard, who had made it for himself by his spells. But his hatred of other people was as great as his power, and he would not allow any person to come near him except his own servants, and they were evil spirits. If any man dared to go see the palace, to ask for work or to beg for charity, he would never be heard of again. His friends might search for him, but they would never find him. Soon people began to whisper that some of the blocks of granite near the palace were like the men who had gone up the mountain and never came back. They began to believe that the wizard had caught them and frozen them into grey stone. At length, the wizard became the terror of the whole island, so that no person would pass within several miles of his palace. The people of that side of the island fled from their homes, and the place was lonely and desolate. So things went on for 3 years, until one day a poor man going on the houses happened to travel on that side of the island, not knowing anything of this wizard. His road took him over the mountain where the wizard lived, and as he came near it, he was astonished to see the place so silent and desolate. He had been looking forward to the usual food and shelter, with the friendly welcome, but he found the houses empty ruins and the kindly country people gone. And where was the straw and hay which made such a snug bed in the barn? Weeds and stones were lying thick in the fields. Night came on him, and he walked and walked, but never a bit of shelter could he find, and he did not know where to go to get a bed. "It's a middlin' dark night," he thought, "but it's better to go on than back. A road a body is used on is no trouble to them, and it might be night or not." He was traveling on the old road over the mountain, going ahead singing Calcarag Rabby for company to himself, and after a long while he saw a light in the distance. The light got brighter and brighter, until he came to a grand palace with every window lit up. The singing was all knocked out of him. "In the name of fortune, where am I at all?" "This is a dreadful big house," he said to himself. "Where did it come from, for all? Nobody never seen the like of it on this bare breast before. Else where am I at all? He was hard set to get to the door with the blocks of stone lying about like frozen men. "I'd swear," he said to himself as he stumbled over one, "that this was Lil Neddy home. The dwarf man that's missing, only a stone." When he came to the big door, it was locked. Through one of the windows he saw a table, and supper ready on it, but he saw no person. He was very tired and hungry, but he was afraid to knock at the door of such a fine place. "Ah, that place is too grand for the likes of me," said he. He sat down on one of the marble seats outside, saying, "I'll stretch meself here till morning. It's a middlin' sort o' night." That day, meat and bread had been given to him at the last town he had passed through. He was hungry, and he thought that he would eat, so he opened his wallet and took out a piece of bread and meat. Then he put his hand into his pocket and drew out a pinch of salt and a screw of paper. As he opened the paper, some grains of salt fell out onto the ground. No sooner had this happened than up from the ground beneath came the sound of most terrible groans. High winds blew from every airt out of the heavens. Lightnings flashed in the air. Dreadful thunder crashed overhead, and the ground heaved beneath his feet. And he knew that there was plenty of company round him, though no man was to be seen. In less than a moment, the grand palace burst into 1,000 pieces, and vanished into the air. He found himself on a wide, lonely mountain, and in the grey light of dawn, no trace of the palace was to be seen. He went down on his knees, and put up a prayer of thanksgiving for his escape, and then ran on to the next village, where he told the people all that he had seen, and glad they were to hear of the disappearance of the wizard. End of chapter 26. Recording by Andrew Calvillo.
Chapter 27 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Chapter 27. The Enchanted Isle. Out under the Irish Sea, 15 or 16 miles southwest of the Calf, there is an enchanted isle. Long, long ago it was on the surface of the water. That was in the days when Manannán ruled in Man. But when St. Patrick drove Manannán and his men from the island in the form of three-legged creatures, they came upon this isle. Manannán dropped it to the bottom of the sea, and they were seen no more. Now it is the home of Manannán mac Lir, son of the sea, and he rules it as he used to rule Man. But once in 7 years, when Old May Day is on a Sunday, the isle may be seen. It rises up from the sea just before sunrise, like a beautiful vision, and Manannán looks once more at Ellen Vannin. The hills of the enchanted isle are green. White foam rings it round, and if you are near enough, you may see the tossing arms and golden hair of the mermaids by the water's edge, washing their glittering jewels, and hear the singing of birds, and smell the fragrant scent of flowers. But as the first rays of the sun rest upon its highest hills, it sinks into the deep, deep sea. End of chapter 27. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 28 of the Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pinchcliffe. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Chapter 28. Stories about birds. Number 1. The Ravens. 2 ravens met once, and one asked the other in bird language, "Is there anything new at you?" "The white horse is dead," said he. "Is he fat? Is he fat?" said the other. "Delicious, delicious," said he. Then he repented that he had told him that, and called out, "Bare bones, bare bones." Number 2. Blackbird's Morning Song. Old Robin Quirk one fine morning was sitting sunning himself before his cottage door, when the blackbird, living in the tranum tree in his garden, flew down, settled near Robin, and began to talk to him in Manx. "Iree, Robin, as gal smoke." "Rise, Robin, and take a smoke." "Chanel thumbaga, I am." "I have no tobacco," said Robin. "Gione, gione." Buy it," cried Blackbird. "Chanel ping I am." "I have not a penny," poor Robin said. "Jow Dale, Gower Dale." "Gower Dale, Gower Dale." Credit it," was Blackbird's bad advice. "Chada ad Dale, though, boy." "They won't give me credit, boy." "Quit-ish, quit-a." "Quit it then, quit it," whistled Blackbird, flying home and closing the discussion. "The imprints of sin is in them blackbirds," Robin said. Number 3. How the Wren became king of the birds. A long, long time ago, before you and I were born, the birds of the air gathered at Tynwald from all airts of the wind. The meeting was to settle once and for all the squabbling and fighting among them as to which of them was the cleverest, and it was agreed that the cleverest bird should be king. The sky was black with them, big and little, and soon all had gathered together. Everywhere groups of birds sat a row, cooishing, scolding, or sleeping. Some were in fine, black Sunday coats, like old Parson Gull, some clad only in workaday brown, like poor Brownie, the hedge sparrow. But most wore leggings of red or yellow, while the cough had a new pair of bright red ones. Yellow Tommy the dandy was preening himself, swinging on the top of a gorse bush. Old Greyback the crow, perched on a rock above him, silent but observant, was eating flitters. And over all, the blue arch of the sky, in which hung motionless a broad-winged eagle. The corncrake officially announced, "Rape, rape, ready, ready." Then each one got up in his turn, to tell of all the great things that he could do. The falcon boasted that he and his mate were worth the kingdom of man, with all its rights. Londu, the thrush, sang her best to them. It was a pleasure to listen to her, and for a moment she thought that she would be elected. Flame of the Wood, the goldfinch, spread her bright plumage. Fork of the Wind, the swallow, told of her swiftness and travels to warm countries in the south. The curlew, of her riches. "Let the curlew be poor or fat, she carries a groat upon her back," said she, throwing the mark of 4 which she bears. When the cuckoo got up, the meadow pipit darted out from a group, and danced around, calling out his name to draw attention to himself, the little fool, and saying, "Let every bird hatch her own eggs," so poor Cuckoo wasn't heard. There was a loud voiced dispute between the magpie and the jackdaw as to which the best thief. At last Jimmy Wren got up to have her say, after all the grand ones had done. "Ha ha ha," laughed the snipe, and all the birds chuckled. Jinny Wren got the better of them for all that. Says she, "Small though I am, and slender my leg, 12 chicks I can bring out of the egg." And the birds agreed that Jinny was as clever again as the best of them. But the eagle didn't like it that a little bit of a bird like Jinny Wren should be over him. So he considered for a minute, and says he, middling vexed, "Birds, it's only right that the best bird on the wing should be king. Let's try heat to see which of us can go the highest." Hullard the old owl looked thoughtful and said, "I never saw anything yet worth flying for." But the bird said, "'Deed, it wouldn't be a bad idea at all." no sooner said than done. Ginny Diver, the cormorant, gave the whistle to fly, and instantly off they started. Speeding on great strong wings, the eagle led the way. The little ones were following. Pompey Knee, Forearm, fat bird of the barley, straggling far in the rear. But the 7 sleepers, the bat, the stone chat, Chewag the cuckoo, and others didn't stir. The sleep had fallen on them. The eagle flew up and away, away to the sun, till he couldn't lift a feather an inch higher. Then he peered down into the blue to the birds far, far below, and he let a scream out from him. Tarmish Ree ni en, Ree ni en. I'm king of the birds, king of the birds. But little Ginny Wren was one too many for him there again. She had taken tight hold of him by a feather under his great broad wing and hidden herself. And as he cried, Tarmish Ree ni een, she flew on top of his head and called out, Charnel, Charnel, Tarmish Eri Skain. Not so, not so. I'm above him, I'm above him. Down dropped the eagle, and dropped the wren, breathless, but king of the birds. And that's why the boys go round on St. Stephen's Day to this day singing, the wren, the king of all birds. We've caught St. Stephen's Day in the gorse. Though he's small, his family is many. We pray you, good woman, give us a drop to drink. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. The Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. The Maudie Dhu, or the Black Dog of Peel Castle. In the days when Charles II was king in England, and Charles, Earl of Derby, king in Man, Peel Castle was always garrisoned by soldiers. The guard room was just inside the great entrance gate of the castle, and a passage used to lead from it, through one of the old churches, to the captain of the guard's room. At the end of the day one of the soldiers locked the castle gates and carried the keys through the dark passage to the captain. They would take it in turns. About this time one and another began to notice, sometimes in one room, sometimes in another, a big black dog with rough curly hair. He did not belong to any person there, and nobody knew anything about him. But every night when the candles were lighted in the guard room, and the fire was burning bright, he would come from the dark passage and lay himself down by the hearth. He made no sound, but lay there till the break of day, and then he would get up and disappear into the passage. The soldiers were terrified of him at first, but after a time they were used to the sight of him and lost some of their fear, though they still looked on him as something more than mortal. While he was in the room the men were quiet and sober, and no bad words were spoken. When the hour came to carry the keys to the captain, 2 of them would always go together. No man would face the dark passage alone. One night, however, one foolish fellow had drunk more than was good for him, and he began to brag and boast that he was not afraid of the dog. It was not his turn to take the keys, but to show how brave he was, he said he would take them alone. He dared the dog to follow him. "Let him come," he shouted, laughing. "I'll see whether he be dog or devil." His friends were terrified and tried to hold him back, but he snatched up the keys and went out into the passage. The black dog slowly got up from before the fire and followed him. There was a dead silence in the guard room. No sound was heard but the dashing of the waves on the steep rocks of the castle islet. After a few minutes there came from the dark passage the most awful and unearthly screams and howls, but not a soldier dared to move to see what was going on. They looked at each other in horror. Presently they heard steps, and the rash fellow came back into the room. His face was ghastly pale and twisted with fear. He spoke not a word, then or afterwards. In 3 days he was dead, and nobody ever knew what had happened to him that fearful night. The black dog has never been seen again. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Little Red Bird. Little red bird of the black turf ground, where did you sleep last night? I slept last night on the top of the briar, and oh, what a wretched sleep! Little red bird of the black turf ground, where did you sleep last night? I slept last night on the top of the bush, and oh, what a wretched sleep! Little red bird of the black turf ground, where did you sleep last night? I slept last night on the ridge of the roof, and oh, what a wretched sleep! Little red bird of the black turf ground, where did you sleep last night? I slept last night between 2 leaves, as the babe twists 2 blankets quite at ease, and oh, what a peaceful sleep! An Old Manx Lullaby. End of Little Red Bird.
Chapter 31 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Tehi Tegi. Long hundreds of years ago, there was a witch in the island who made herself the finest and cleverest looking young woman in it. Her like for beauty was never before seen in this mortal world. When she went out walking or riding, the very birds of the air would forget to sing for looking at her, and her sweet voice would tempt them off the trees to listen to her. Even the animals would stand still till she went by, for her beauty cast a spell on them. And as for the men, the poor creatures, they flocked from all sides of the island to woo her, and when they had once looked on her face, they never wanted to leave her. They forgot everything else in the world, all sorrow and care, home and country, till at last everything in the island came to a standstill because the men followed wherever this young witch chose to lead them. Their haggards were empty, for they neither plowed nor sowed, and their houses tholthans, for they never built nor mended. They cut no turf and pulled no ling for fires. Their fields were covered with stones, so that the cattle died for want of pasture, and their gardens were full of weeds. There was a strange stillness throughout the island. No children's voices were to be heard anywhere. The witch only laughed to see what her beauty had done, and she kept all the men near her by making each think that himself might be the chosen one. If one asked her to marry him, she would answer, "And maybe I will," and then she would say the same to the next. So they spent their days in pleasuring themselves. When she had made slaves of the men of the island in this way, she said one day, "Saddle me my horse, for I've a mind to ride." So they brought her milk-white horse shod with shoes of gold, with bit of gold and bridle set with jewels, with saddle of mother of pearl and saddle-cloth of blue. Tehi Tegi mounted, and the waves of her golden hair flowed down over her dress of shining white. "I'm going," said she, "to the country for the day, and you can follow me on foot if you like." She rode and took her way under shady trees and through grassy lanes, where bluebells and primroses grew as thick as the grass, and the hedges were yellow with gorse. She went on by fields covered with stones, which were once fine corn land, and on she went at the head of them by lonely little tholthans whose roof had sunk in on the hearth, and then by spots where houses once had been, now marked by jenny nettles and an old tramman tree. Her way mounted upwards among hills shining in the May sunlight, and through gills where little streams ran down between banks covered with fern and briar and many a flower to the blue sea.
At last they found themselves at the side of a bright, swift river, and she put a spell on it and made it seem shallow and as smooth and clear as glass, so that the little stones at the bottom were barely covered. Then, when they were all beginning to wade through it, she took off the spell and the water rushed over their heads and swallowed up the 600 poor lovers. With that she made a bat of herself and rose up in the air and flew out of sight. Her milk-white horse turned into a perkin, plunged to the bottom of the stream, and swam away out to sea and was never more seen. From that time the wise men of the island made their women go on foot and follow their husbands wherever they should lead, so that no such accident should happen again. If by chance a woman went first, any one who saw her cried out, "Tehi tegi! Tehi tegi!" End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Robinson. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Chapter 32. Johnny Charon's Journey. Johnny Charon took the biggest journey in his life without meaning to do it at all. One night, he was going towards Balaquirk, taking his time and thinking of his younger days, when all of a sudden he heard a great murmur of people coming up behind him, and, before he had time to look round him, he felt himself getting jostled, and a voice asked him, middling sharp too, "What business have you here on our way at this hour of the night?" "I'm sorry to give anyone trouble," said John. "I'll get over the hedge out of the road." Then the leader came and touched him with the little stick he was carrying, and said to the others, "We'll take him with us. He'll be useful enough among the rest." At that there was a big titter, and John felt himself all altered like, and a thing like a load came onto his back. Then they all went on together, themselves talking and laughing away. As soon as they came near the Ballarat chapel, though, all was silent as the grave. The houses were dark, and the only thing they saw stirring was Quelish's dog, and as soon as he smelt themselves he took to his heels with his tail between his legs. It was a fine, easy night with just a touch of soft fog on, and a little air coming down from the mountain as we got to Dream y Cousage. There the leader sounded a big ram's horn, and as they went galloping down to the Down, out came some more of the Lil fellows from the Gill and joined them, and more talking and laughing went on. He blew another blast at Ballalin, and there they could see the fog rolling down from Cregnymolt. Again he blew at Ballagorry, and they slacked down a bit, and you would have thought the whole glen would have wakened up with the echoes. Down at the bridge, they could see the lights going about like will-o'-the-wisps. Then the leader shouted, "Get into your lines there, me boys!" And the mug-holed Lil fellows put themselves in rows on the walls of the bridge, just under the big cherry trees, holding their colored lanthorns on the points of their sticks to give light round that dirty turn. Then, when all had passed, they joined in and followed behind. Away they all went, down Slieugh Luidge, fit to break their necks. They slackened off a bit as they got to Follew, and then took their time as far as Bellor's Bridge, where there was a big lanthorn hanging up in a tree over the old mill. As soon as they saw this, two of themselves blew horns, and then a host of riders came out of the mill, blowing horns too. They turned up the Gill, and all of a sudden the whole crowd, with John among them, were right in the middle of a big camp of the Lil people. There were lights hanging all about in the trees, and fires blazing under the cowrie pots, and musicians playing fine music. Oh, the taking joy there was! Some were going round, giving horn spoons for the cowrie and the bingeen, and then handing around the oat bread and the cheese, and the Tramamin wine. Then the little fiddlers and fluters and reed fellows and the drummers got up on top of a big rock, and the Lil fellows began to dance, till John's head took the reel watching them. It was a grand sight to see the nice little girls in their red petticoats and white stockings and shoes with silver buckles on, and little bells all tinkling in their hair, and the little men in their white knee breeches, log-tan stockings, and spotted carans. In the middle of it all, up came the Lil captain, and, "John," says he, "what do you think of this sight, boy?"
"It's mortal grand," says John, "far beyond any of the carnivals I've seen before, and how long will it last?" Maybe a fortnight, said he, laughing heartily. And maybe more, so you'd be better to go back to your own people. How'll I get back at all, and in the dark too, says John. Chut, man, he said, tipping John on the head with his little stick again. John didn't remember any more till he wakened at the break of day close to his own house, and little the worse for his long journey. End of chapter 32. Recording by Robert Robinson.
Chapter 33 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. A Bad Wish. May the chimney hook, like the pot hooks, against thee rise in cruel war. The ladle, the dishes, and the pot stick, for the dread attack prepare. May the pot stick and the round tables, cresset, noggin, and hardware store, all help to tear and flay and skin thee, when felled beneath them on the floor. What if the spotted water bowl and the glashton would thee take for all, and the fynoderee of the glen waddling to make of thee a bolster against the wall? The fairy of glen and buggane, Finn McCool and all his company, may they gather together about thy bed, and in a straw rope creel run off with thee. From an old Manx ballad. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Witch of Sloo Wallian. It was midsummer day, and the Peel herring fleet, with sails half set, was ready for sea. The men had their barley sown, and their potatoes down, and now their boats were rigged and nets stowed on board, and they were ready for the harvest of the sea. It was a fine day. The sky was clear, and the wind was in the right airt, being from the north. But, as they say, if custom will not get custom, custom will weep. A basinful of water was brought from the holy well and given to the wise woman that sold fair winds, as she stood on the harbor side with the women and children to watch the boats off. They told her to look, and to tell of the luck of the herring fleet. She bent over the water, and, as she looked, her face grew pale with fear, and she gasped, "Hurroos, hurroos, and do ye know what I'm seeing?" "Let us hear," said they. "I'm seeing the wild waves lashed to a foam away by the great Brada head. I'm seeing the surge round the Chicken's Rock, and the breaker lip is red. I'm seeing where corpses toss in the sound, with nets and gears and spars, and never a one of the fishing fleet is riding under the stars." There was a dead hush, and the men gathered close together, muttering, till Gory, the admiral of the fishing fleet, stepped forward, caught the basin out of her hands, and flung it out to sea, growling, sure as I'm alive, woman. I've more than half a mind to heave you in after it. If I had my way, the like of you and your crew would be run into the sea. Boys, we're going to lose a shot for that bleb. Come on, let's go and chance it with the help of God. Aye, no herring, no wedding. Let's go and chance it, said young Cashin. So, hoisting sails, they left the port, and when the land was fairly opened out, so that they could see the calf, they headed for the south, and stood out for the shoulder. Soon a fine breeze put them in a fishing ground, and every man was looking for signs of herring, perkins, gannets, fish playing on the surface, oily water, and such like. When the sun was set, and the evening was too dark to see the admiral's flag, the skipper of each lugger held his arm out at full length, and when he could no longer see the black in his thumbnail, he ordered the men to shoot their nets. And as they lay to their trains, it all fell out as the witch said. Soon the sea put on another face. The wind from westward blew a sudden gale and swelled up the waves with foam. The boats were driven hither and thither, and the anchors dragged quickly behind them. The men hoisted sail before the wind and struggled to get back to land, and the lightning was all the light they had. It was so black dark that they could see no hill, and above the uproar of the sea they could hear the surges pounding on the rocky coast. The waves were rising like mountains, breaking over the boats and harrying them from stem to stern. They were dashed to pieces on the rocks of the Calf, and only 2 men escaped with their lives. But there was one boat that had got safe back to port before the storm, and that was the boat of the 7 boys. She was a Dalby boat, and belonged to 7 young men who were all unmarried. They were always good to the Duany Mary, the merman, and when they were hauling their nets, they would throw him a fishful of herring, and in return they always had good luck with their fishing. This night, after the fleet had shot their nets some time, the night being still fine and calm, the 7 boys heard the voice of the merman hailing them and saying, "It is calm and fine now. There will be storm soon enough." When the skipper heard this, he said, "Every herring must hang by its own gills." And he and his crew at once put their nets on the board and gained the harbor. And it was given for law ever after that no crew was to be made up of single men only. There was to be at least 1 married man on board, and no man was bound by his hiring to fish in the same South Sea, which was called the Sea of Blood from that day. As for the witch, they said that she had raised the storm by her spells, and they took her to the top of the great mountain, Slewalian, put her into a spiked barrel, and rolled her from the top to the bottom, where the barrel sank into the bog. For many and many a long year there was a bare track down the steep mountainside, where grass would never grow, nor ling nor gorse. They called it the Witch's Way, and they say that her screams are heard in the air every year on the day that she was put to death. End of chapter 34. Recording by Andrew Calvillo.
Chapter 35 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. The Old Christmas. In the days of our grandmothers, Old Christmas Day, the 5th of January, was believed to be the true Christmas. On Black Thomas's Eve, which was the first day of the Christmas holidays, the spinning wheels all had to be put away, the making of nets ceased, and no work of any kind must be done until the 12th day. But there was once an old woman named Peggy Shimmin, a Coelho, and she was bent on finishing some spinning that she had begun. So on Old Christmas Eve she said to herself, "The new Christmas is past, and surely it's no wrong to do a bit of spinning to-night," though she doubted in her heart if she were not sinning. So when himself and the rest were in bed, she called her young servant girl, Lil Margad, and said, "Margad, me and you will finish the spinning to-night." Margad was frightened terrible, but she got out her wheel and sat beside her mistress. The 2 began to spin, and they were spinning and spinning till near midnight. And behold ye, just before midnight old Peggy saw the flax she was drawing from the distaff grow blacker and blacker, till it was as black as tar. But Margad's flax did not change color, because she had only done what her mistress bade her. Peggy dropped the flax quick, put away her wheel, and crept in fear to bed. She knew now which was the true Christmas Day, and never more did she spin on Old Christmas Eve. Margad was left alone in the kitchen when her mistress had gone to bed, and at first she was trembling with fright. But she was a middling brave girl, and she took a notion, as there was no person to stop her, to see if all the things were true that she had heard about Old Christmas Eve. "They're saying," she thought, "that the bees are coming out, and 3-year-old bullocks going down on their knees, and the myrrh coming up in bloom." Then she says to herself, "I'm thinking I'll go out and watch the myrrh." So she put on a cloak round her, and crept out at the door into the cold, frosty, moonlit night. And midnight had just struck as she put her foot outside. She stooped to look on the spot where the myrrh root was buried, and as she was looking the earth began to stir and to crack, and soon two little green shoots pushed up to the air. She ran closer to see what would happen, and to her great wonder the leaves and stalks grew big and strong before her eyes, and then the buds began to show, and in a few minutes the lovely white flowers were in bloom, and the garden was sweet with their fragrance. Margad could do nothing but stare at them at first, but at last she dared to gather one small piece of the blossom, and she kept it for luck all her life. Then she went to the cow house and peeped through the door. She heard a groaning sound, and there were the young bullocks on their knees, moaning, and the sweat was dropping from them. Margad knelt down too, and put up a bit of prayer to the Holy Child that was born in a stall. But the wonders were not over yet, for as she went silently back to the house, she noticed that the bees were singing and flying round the hive. They were inside again when she shut the door of the house behind her. Always after that, when the neighbors would ask if she believed in the wonders of old Christmas Eve, she would say, "I know it's true, for I've seen it myself." End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. The Bagain of St. Trinians. A long time ago there came some monks to the broad, rough meadow, which is between dark Greba Mountain and the high road, and they chose a nice place and set up a church to St. Trinian on it. But they reckoned without the power of the Bagain, who had his haunt in the mountain. The Bagain was mighty angry, and he said to himself, "I'll have no peace night or day with their jingling bells if I let them finish the building." And as he had nothing else to do, he took it into his head to amuse himself by tossing off the roof. So when the roof of the church was first put on, there was heard that very night a dreadful sound in it, and when the people of Greba got up early next morning, they found their church roofless, and planks and broken beams all around the place. After a time, and with great effort, the roof was put on again. But when it was on, a great storm arose in the night, and it was blown down from the walls exactly as had happened before. This fall put fear in the people, for they were sure now that it was the evil, destructive Bagain himself that was doing the mischief. But though they were terrified, they resolved to make one more attempt, and the third roof was nearly finished. Now there was a brave little tailor living about a mile from Greba, and because he had not too much worldly gear, he made a wager that when the new roof was on, he would not only spend the first night in the church, but also make a pair of breeches there. The wager was taken up eagerly, as they hoped that if the roof was one night up, it would be left on. So Timothy, that was the name of the little tailor, went to the church on the very first evening after the new roof had been put on. He started just when the shadow was beginning to get gray by the hedges. He took with him cloth, needle, and thread, thimble and scissors. He entered the church boldly, lit a couple of big candles, and looked all over the building to see that everything was right. Then he locked the door so that there was no way to get in. He cut out the cloth, and seating himself cross-legged in the chancel, he put on his thimble and set to work at the breeches. He paid no heed to the darkness of the lonely church at dead of night, but with long thread and needle he bent low over his work, his fingers moving backwards and forwards rapidly, casting strange, beckoning shadows on the walls. The breeches had got to be finished, or he would lose his wager, So he stitched away as fast as he could, thinking about the good money the people would have to give him. The wind was beginning to rise, and trees scutched their arms against the windows. The tailor looked cautiously up and down and round about. Nothing strange came in sight, and he took courage. Then he threaded his needle and began his work again. He gave another sharp glance around, but saw nothing at all except the glimmer of the place near the candles, an empty, deep darkness away beyond them. So his courage rose high, and he said to himself, "It's all foolishness that's at the people about the Buggane, for after all the like isn't in." But at that very minute the ground heaved up under him, and rumbling sounds came up from below. The sounds grew louder underneath, and Timothy glanced quickly up. All of a sudden a great big head broke a hole through the pavement just before him, and came slowly rising up through the hole. It was covered with a mane of coarse black hair. It had eyes like torches and glittering sharp tusks. And when the head had risen above the pavement, the fiery eyes glared fiercely at Tim. The big ugly red mouth opened wide, and a dreadful voice said, "Thou rascal, what business hast thou here?" Tim paid no heed, but worked harder still, for he knew he had no time to lose. "Dost thou see this big head of mine?" yelled the Buggane. I see," replied Tim mockingly. Up came a big, broad pair of shoulders, then a thick arm shot out, and a great fist shook in the tailor's face. "Dost thou see my long arms?" roared the voice. I see," answered Tim boldly, and he stopped his tailoring to snuff one of the guttering candles, and he threw the burning snuff in the scowling face before him. Then he went on with his tailoring. The Buggane kept rising and rising up through the hole, until the horrible form, black as ebony and covered with wrinkles, like the leather of a blacksmith's bellows, had risen quite out of the ground. "Dost thou see this big body of mine?" roared the Buggane, angry that Tim showed no fear of him. I see," replied the tailor, at the same time stitching with all his might at the breeches. "Dost thou see my sharp claws?" roared the Buggane in a more angry voice than before. I see," answered again the little tailor, without raising his eyes, and continuing to pull out with all his might. "Dost thou see my cloven foot?" thundered the Buggane, drawing up one big foot and planking it down on the pavement with a thud that made the walls shake. I see," replied the little tailor as before, stitching hard at the breeches and taking long stitches. Lifting up his other foot, the Buggane, in a furious rage, yelled, "Dost thou see my rough arms, my bony fingers, my hard fists, my—" Before he could utter another syllable, or put the other foot out of the ground, the little tailor quickly jumped up and made 2 stitches together. The breeches were at last finished. Then with one spring he made a leap through the nearest window. But scarcely was he outside the walls, when down fell the new roof with a terrible crash that made Tim jump a great deal more nimbly than he ever did before. Hearing the Buggane's fiendish guffaws of laughter behind him, he took to his heels and sped hot-foot along the Douglas road, the breeches under his arms, and the furious Buggane in full chase. The tailor made for Moraun Church, only a little distance away, and knew he would be safe if he could only reach the churchyard. He ran faster still, he reached the wall, he leaped over it like a hunted hare, and fell weary and spent upon the grass, under the shadow of the church, where the Buggane had not power to follow. So furious was the monster at this, that he seized his own head with his 2 hands, tore it off his body, and sent it flying over the wall after the tailor. It burst at his feet with a terrific explosion, and with that the Buggane vanished, and was never seen or heard of afterwards. Wonderful to relate, the tailor was not hurt, and he won the wager, for no person grumbled at the few long stitches put into the breeches. And as for St. Trinian's Church, there is no name on it from that day till this but Cielvrisht, broken church, for its roof was never replaced. There it stands in the green meadow under the shadow of rocky Greba Mountain, and there its grey roofless ruins are to be found now. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kurt from Tucson, Arizona. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. King Magnus Barefoot. Magnus, great nephew of Olaf the Saint, was king of Norway in the days when the Norwegian kings were lords over man, and he was called by the name of Barefoot because he wore kilts. He was the bravest and most beautiful young king of his time, tall and strong and brilliant as a meteor. He wore a helmet on his head, and carried a red shield with a golden lion upon it. He had in his belt a sword of exceeding sharpness, with an ivory hilt inlaid with gold, and a keen javelin in his hand. Over his coat of mail was a tunic of ruby red, embroidered with a golden lion. He was a fine and valiant figure. It was he who brought King Olaf's cup of peace to our island, and this is the way it happened. Magnus was sitting at supper one day with his chief men, and their talk ran on the beautiful shrine of Olaf the Saint, which was the wonder of its age. They spake to one another of how it was said that Olaf's body would never be destroyed by death, but would remain as in life, and would heal those who prayed at the shrine of any sickness. Magnus laughed the story to scorn, and said boldly, "Seeing is believing. Let the shrine be opened, that we may see for ourselves if the story be true." Then the bishop and clergy were horrified, and begged the king, "O king, let not the thing be done. It will surely bring evil on thee." But Magnus commanded, "Let the shrine be opened at once. I fear no man, alive or dead." So his will was done. And when the jeweled shrine was opened, all saw the body of holy Olaf lying incorrupt and fair as if alive. Magnus touched it with his hands, but was suddenly seized with a great fear. He went away in haste, but took with him the lovely crystal cup that lay beside the saint. Next night in his sleep he had a vision of King Olaf, majestic and stern, who said to him, "Choose, I tell you, one of two things, either to lose your kingdom and life within 30 days, or to leave Norway and never see it again." Magnus awoke, and called his chiefs and great men to tell them of his vision. "O king," they cried in fear, "leave Norway with all speed, and keep thy life and kingship." So Magnus, who was the last of our great sea kings, got together a fleet of 160 long ships, each with 20 or 30 rowers' benches, and with bows carved in the shape of dragons. He loved the sea, and like a true Viking, he used to say, "I will never sleep under a sooty rafter, nor drink in the chimney corner." Away he sailed to the Orkneys. He conquered them and all the western islands, and came to Man. He put in at St. Patrick's Isle, and went to see the site of the Battle of Sant Wat near Peel, which had been fought 3 days before between the Manx of north and south. The beauty of our island pleased his eyes, and he chose it for his dwelling place. He made the men of Galloway cut timber and bring it over to make 3 forts for him. In one of them, near Douglas, he placed the cup of peace, which he knew would be well guarded by the Lianan Shee, the peace fairy, who never left it. Then he sailed to Anglesey, and made himself lord over it, but he soon came back to the Isle of Man, for it pleased him best. On his return he sent his dirty shoes over to Morro, King of Ireland, with this message: "Magnus Barefoot, King of Norway and the Isles, bids thee carry his dirty shoes on thy shoulders through thy house on Christmas Day in thy royal state, and own that thou hast thy kingdom and power from the Lord of Norway and the Isles, and this thou must do in sight of his envoys." When the Irish heard this, they were furiously angry and indignant, but wise King Morro said, I will not only carry the shoes, but eat them, rather than that Magnus should ruin a single province in Ireland." Then he carried the shoes on Christmas Day as Magnus bade, treated the messengers with honour, and sent them back to Man with many fine gifts for their king, with whom he made a treaty of peace. But the envoys told their master of the richness of the Irish lands and the pleasantness of the air, and Magnus kept it in his mind. After this, the King of Scotland sent a message to him, saying, "Cease to make war against me, and I will yield thee those of the Western Isles that thou canst from the mainland go round in a vessel with a paddle rudder." Magnus made peace on those terms, and so the Norse kings gained the Southern Isles, among which they counted the peninsula of Cantyre, because Magnus, sitting at the helm, caused his great warship to be dragged across the neck of the land which joins it to the mainland. His Vikings shouted with triumph as they pulled the ship along, with their young king in his red and gold laughing at the stern. But all this time, in his heart, Magnus could think of nothing but the conquest of Ireland. He sailed to the coast of Down, where he began to invade and pillage. It was on St. Bartholomew's Day, 1103, that his last battle was fought. The Irish had promised to bring him cattle for his troops the day before, but as they had not come, he landed his men and marched them to the top of the hill on the plain of Coba. From this place he could see all the country round, and presently there appeared a great cloud of dust in the distance. Some of his men said that it was an army approaching, others that it was the herd of cattle. The last were right, and when the cattle had been handed over, Magnus and his men returned towards his ships. It was now the noon of a calm and sunny day. When they reached the marshes, suddenly a band of Irish rushed out from their ambush in a wood close by, and attacked them fiercely. Magnus ordered his chief, Eyvinder, to sound the trumpet and summon his men around the royal standard. He ordered them to close ranks with overlapping shields until they got to the dry ground where they would be safe. They made their way as far as an old fort, but the Irish pressed them and slew many of them. Then the king called to a chief named Thorgrim. "Do you, with your cohort, cross the rampart and occupy the hill opposite with your archers, till we join you." Thorgrim and his men did as they were told, and crossed over, but when they were across, they put their shields on their backs and fled to the ships. When Magnus saw them, he shouted, "Is it thus you run, you coward? I was a fool to send you instead of Sigurd, who would not thus desert me." Magnus fought like a lion, but soon he was pierced through the thigh by a spear. He pulled it out and snapped it beneath his feet, crying, "Thus we young warriors break these twigs. Fight on bravely, my men, and fear no danger for me." His men prayed him to try to spare himself, but he said, "Better for a people to have a brave king than an old king." And so saying, foremost in battle, he met his death. End of chapter 37.
Chapter 38 of Manx Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. Manx Fairy Tales by Sophia Morrison. Chapter 38. Manannán Maci Lir. Manannán Beg was son of Lir. He was the first that ever had man. But as it seemeth unto me, he himself was but a heathen. 'Twas not with his sword he kept her, nor with his arrows, nor his bow, but when he would see ships sailing, he hid her right round with a fog. He'd set a man upon a brow, you'd think there were 100 there, and thus did wild Manannán guard that island with all its booty. The rent each paid out of the land was a bundle of green rushes, and that was on them for a tax throughout the country each John's Eve. Some went up with the rushes to the great mountain up at Barrule, others would leave the grass below, with Manannán above Kimule. In this way then they lived, I think, myself their tribute very small, without care or anxiety, or labour to cause weariness. Old Ballad. Manannan mac y Lir. Manannan mac y Lir, the son of the sea, was the first ruler of men. He was a great wizard, and he was so powerful that afterwards he was looked on as a god. He had a great stone fort on Peel Island, and he could make one man, standing on its battlements, seem to be 100. When he saw his enemies' ships sailing, he would cover the island round with a silver mist, so that it could not be seen, and if, in spite of the mist, his enemies came near, he would throw chips into the water and change them into ships. He was out walking one day on Barrule, when he saw the warships of the Northmen were in the Bay of Peel, and with that he made himself into the shape of 3 legs, and rolled like a wheel down from the mountain top as fast as the wind. It was about low tide in the harbour, and there ran a stream of sparkling water out to sea. Now the banks of the stream were marshy, and by the river side grew a quantity of sedge with broad green leaves. So Manannan made little boats of the sedge, a good number of them, and sailed his boats in the stream. And when the little fleet floated out of the harbour, he caused them to look like great ships of war, well manned with fighting men. Then terror seized on the Northmen when they saw the Manx fleet, and they cut their cables, hoisted sails, and cleared away as fast as they could, and Manannan and his island were left in peace. Thus did he keep men, and not with his sword or his bow and arrows. In his fort he had a great banqueting hall, where handsome boys made sweet music, and others played games and did great feats of strength. He had a horse called Anbar of the flowing mane, who could travel like the wind over sea as well as land, swift hounds that could catch any wild beast, and a sword called the Answerer, whose wound was always fatal, besides his magic branch and his wonderful boat, Wave Sweeper. He governed men well for long, long years. Manx people had the best of good treatment from him, and all the rent he wanted was that each one was to bring a bundle of green rushes to him on the mountain of South Barrule on Midsummer Eve. The island was a happy place, full of sunshine and all pleasant things, and no person there was old or tired or sad. Manx men have never forgotten Manannan, and this 1,000 years our fishermen have prayed to him the following prayer as they have put out to sea. Even up to the days of our fathers it has been used. Manannan bec mac y Lir, little Manannan, son of the sea, who blessed our island, bless us and our boat, going out well, coming in better, with living and dead in our abode. End of chapter 38.
Chapter 39 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darko. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Chapter 39. The Cormorant and the Bat. There was a time in the olden days when the cormorant and the bat took counsel together to do something for the poor, as they had compassion on them, and they went into the glens gathering wool to make clothing for them. When they had a quantity gathered, they took a boat and put out to sea. It happened, as they were sailing, that a storm came on, and the waves were breaking over the vessel, insomuch that the poor bat had to leap from place to place to escape the water, and in the darkness he was cast out of the boat, clinging to an oar. At daybreak he was near the shore, and flew unto dry land. A seagull, standing near by, inquired, "Och, little batvo, what's there doing on thee that thou art all of a thriddle of thrimblin like this?" When he heard the bat's story, he said, "As sure as can be, if he will happen on thee, he will take thy life." They had given each other a promise that one would not leave the other until they had completed their task. The bat was so frightened that he hid himself in an old ruin until the darkness came on, and from that time until now he will only venture out under covering of the night. The cormorant held on to the boat until she filled with water and sank to the bottom of the sea. At last he flew to a rock, and there sat for hours together, day after day, looking out for the bat. At other times he would go for a season into the glens, and in this way they continue from that storm to the present time. The one hides himself, and the other seeks him. End of chapter 39. The Cormorant and the Bat. Recording by Darko.
Chapter 40 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Henry. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. Cailleach na Fáiseach, or the Prophet Wizard. In the old days, when there were wizards and witches in the Isle of Man, the greatest wizard of all was Cailleach na Fáiseach. He did not live above ground, but in a quarry, in a hole under the rock on the lonely mountainside, and that is why the people called him the Prophet Wizard of the wilderness. At dark he would roam over the mountains, and people walking there when night was drawing on would hear him crying out, "Ho, ho, ho," like the bellow of a goat, in a voice so terrible and strong that the earth and all who heard it trembled with fear. He could change himself into any shape he liked. Sometimes he would be a goat with big fiery eyes, at other times a tall, tall man. Once, when he was a goat, he followed a man that was walking along the mountain road, and that time he had eyes in him as big as 2 dishes. The man was carrying a lantern, and as he shifted it from one hand to the other, the goat followed it from side to side. The man was terrified and began to run. As soon as he left the mountain road, the beast roared after him, "Ho, ho, ho." Another time, in the shape of a tall, tall man, as tall as 2 men, he followed a woman who struck across the mountain at Garry Moor, and he had great big burning eyes, as big as 2 plates, in his head. The woman ran with all her might for life or death, and he ran roaring after her, "Ho, ho, ho." But when she turned down from the mountain, he came no further. He was a great soothsayer, but he would not foretell what was to happen unless some person asked him. It seems that he must have lived for hundreds of years, for he foretold a battle that was fought in 1098. This was the Battle of Santwat, Sandford, between the North and South Manx. He said, "The river Neb shall run red from Glen Crew to the sea, and gulls shall sip their full of the blood of Manninee." It all came true. The Northmen sailed into Peel and ran their flat-bottomed boats up to Glenfaba Ford, where the Southmen met them to keep them from landing. They fought up the stream to Glen Crew, where there was a great slaughter, and the bodies of the slain dammed the stream and turned the little glen into a pool. The waters of the Neb were reddened by Manx blood when they ran into Peel Bay. The south side women had followed the men and were watching the battle from a little distance, but when they saw that the North people were winning, they rushed down and into the heart of the fight, with bratfuls of stones and with hacks, and won the day for the South. And a law was made that henceforth the widows in the south of the island should get half of their husband's estate, but the north side women who stayed at home were to get only 1/3. The Prophet Wizard foretold too the finding of Foxdale lead mines. A man came to him and asked, "How will I get rich, O Cailleach na Fáiseach?" And the wizard answered, "There's a butt in Ballafesson worth the whole of Belladool, but the riches of the Isle of Man lie hid behind Barrule." He also gave this prophecy to old Juan the weaver, who asked him for one. "At the foot of Barrule there will be a market town, Mullen y Claich, with blood for 24 hours will turn round. Now the village of Foxdale stands at the foot of Barrule, and it is said that in the old times a great battle between the Manx and the Irish was fought by the stream above Mullin-y-Cleigh, the mill by the hedge. To a Peel man he foretold, "There will be a battle between the Irish and the Manx at Craigmallon," and the old fishermen say that that battle took place 200 years ago. It was a Sunday when the Irishmen came in the bay, and they found no place to beach their boats, so they turned the Manx boats adrift, and thought they had the place for themselves, but they soon found their masters. The Manx men came after their boats, and there was a battle, red blood running like water. And the battle was not over that day, but they fought round into Douglas, and finished at last in Derby Haven, so the old fishermen say. Then there was an old maid that had a cressid, a melting pot, and she went from house to house making lead spoons. She was a bit queer. She would not smoke a mould on a sunny day, nor a misty day, nor a wet day, nor a windy day. She must have a day to fit herself. She met the Cailleach when he was in the shape of a goat, and she asked him to foretell when would be the end of the world. He said that before the last, "The mountains of man will be cut over with roads, and iron horses will gallop over them, and there will be an inn on the top of Snaefell." That has all come true. Trains rush over the island, and for sure there is the inn on the top of our highest mountain. He said too, "Man and Scotland will come so close that two women, one standing in Man and another in Scotland, will be able to wring a blanket between them." But that has not come true yet, though the sandy point of Ayr is stretching farther and farther towards the Mull of Galloway. And another of his prophecies has not come to pass yet. "The chief rulers of man will be compelled to flee." But it will all be before the end. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. The City Under the Sea. Now where Lang Ness runs its long nose into the sea, and on a place now always covered by the waves, there was once a fine city with many towers and gilded domes. Great ships went sailing from its port to all parts of the world, and round it were well-grassed lands, with cattle and sheep. Even now sailors sometimes see it through the clear deep waters, and hear dimly the bleating of sheep, the barking of dogs, and the muffled chiming of bells. Nine, Jees, Three, Kiar, Quaig. But no man can walk its streets. For once upon a time, in the days when there were giants in the Isle of Man, Finn MacCool had his home near this city. He lived at the Sound to keep his eye on Erin and to watch the sea. But he was very seldom in Man, and whenever he was always doing some mischief, so that his enemies were many. One day he was in such a hurry to reach his home that he jumped from Erin and landed in the island on the rocks above the Sound. He came down with such force that he left his footmarks in the hard stone, and the place has been called ever since Slieugh Éireann ní Cassan, or the mountain of the place of the feet. His first act when he reached home was to get in a red rage with the people of the city close by. His next act was to turn them all into blocks of granite. In his passion he struck the ground so hard with his club that he made a great dent in it. The waves rushed into the deep hollow, and the roaring sea drowned the din of the city. Its towers and domes were covered by the green water. Its streets and market-place, its harbour, and its crowded quays disappeared from sight. And there it lies to this day. But there is a strange story told of a man that went down to it more than 200 years ago. A ship was searching for sunken treasure in those parts, and this man was let down to the bottom of the sea in a kind of ancient diving bell. He was to pull the rope when he wished to be let down further. He pulled and pulled till the men on the ship knew that he was as deep down in the sea as the moon is high up in the sky. Then there was no more rope, and they had to draw him up again. When he was on deck, he told them that if he could have gone further, he would have made the most wonderful discoveries. They begged him to tell them what he had seen, and when he had drunk a cup of wine, he told his story. First, he had passed through the waters in which the fishes live. Then he came into the clear and peaceful region where storms never come, and saw the bottom of the world under sea, shining with coral and bright pebbles. When the diving bell rested on the ground, he looked through its little windows and saw great streets decorated with pillars of crystal glittering like diamonds, and beautiful buildings made of mother of pearl, with shells of every colour set in it. He longed to go into one of these fine houses, but he could not leave his diving bell, or he would have been drowned. He managed to move it close to the entrance of a great hall, with a floor of pearls and rubies and all sorts of precious stones, and with a table and chair of amber. The walls were of jasper, and strings of lovely jewels were hanging on them. The man wished to carry some away with him, but he could not reach them. The rope was at an end. As he rose up again towards the air, he met many handsome mermen and beautiful mermaids, but they were afraid of him and swam away as fast as they could. That was the end of the man's story. After that he grew so sad with longing to go back to the world under sea and stay there forever, that he cared for nothing on earth, and soon died of grief. End of chapter 41.
Chapter 42 of Manx Fairytales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Manx Fairytales by Sophia Morrison. An ancient charm against the fairies. Peace of God and peace of man, peace of God on Colum Calais, on each window and each door, on every hole admitting moonlight, on the four corners of the house, on the place of my rest, and peace of God on myself. The end. End of an ancient charm against the fairies. End of Manx fairy tale by Sophia Morrison.